think we're probably ready to get started. So yeah, I've mentioned at the beginning, but I'm Priya, the marketing assistant at Payara. So I just give a bit of an intro before handing over to Rudy. I know you guys are used to seeing Jaden, but we work really closely together. Thank you for joining. So today we'll be going through the August release of the Payara Platform Community and Enterprise, which came out last week. So Rudy will start with an overview of new features in Community and Enterprise, and then talk about, as mentioned on the agenda, EL expression vulnerability, hot reload with Maven and Gradle, and then OpenId Connect features, and Payara 6 Alpha 1 as well, because we tend to get a lot of questions on that. He'll also touch on our future plans, and then for our kind of monthly theme that we do each month, because of the new security features, it will be OAuth 2 and OpenID authentication and authorization. And there'll also be a poll about midway through, and also an opportunity for any questions. So as usual, if you can type any questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them and flag them to Rudy. And just before I hand over, if you make sure for kind of updates in between releases to follow us on social, I'll post the links now, but it's Payara Services on LinkedIn and Payara_fish on Twitter, which are probably the most useful for kind of updates on different features and how to use them. Also, make sure you're joined to the global meetup group, because that's where there'll be any new events, and it just makes it a lot easier, but there aren't any more at the moment. So yeah, thank you all for joining, and hand over to Rudy.
Yes, thank you, Priya, for the introduction. Since we do it now bi-monthly, it will cover also a few things of the release of July and August. The release within Community and Enterprise, the new features were identical this time, a few smaller changes, but the highlights are identical. So I just thought I'd just go quickly over them, and then I can go a bit deeper in each of them with some explanation and a few demos later on. So within the July release, there was the fix of that EL expression vulnerability. I will show it to you in a moment when you can hit that one, but don't worry, it is a very low graded one, so probably you will have no impact on that one. We also added the possibility to have multiple key stores and trust stores, which you will see is very useful if you're defining or uploading your custom SSL certificates and in relation with upgrade, so that makes the upgrade process easier. And we had also a few data source definition improvements that you can use also EL expressions there. As usual, the full release notes you can find on the Payara documentation site. With the August release of Community, we added support for microprofile 4.1. We were already on 4.0 on Community, so now we have upgraded it to 4.1, which is just an update on the health check specification. And then we added a few new features around OpenId Connect, so the multi-tenancy and the bearer authentications, which I will discuss then in the second half with that monthly theme. And we added some how to reload, how to deploy support for our Maven and Gradle plugins. You can use it separately, but it's mainly as a preparation for the integration within our IDE plugins, but more on that in a minute. For Enterprise, the version numbers are different, but for the rest, the highlights are the same as I mentioned. So 5.29 had that EL expression vulnerability, the multiple key stores. And 5.31 had also that microprofile 4.1. There, it was a jump from 3.3 to 4.1 for the enterprise release. And there are also quite a long list of breaking changes. So we have documented them all on our documentation pages. Also docs Payara.fish for each micro profile spec. You can read there what you can expect if you upgrade from one version to the other version of micro profile, and where you should watch out for something which is breaking. The impact with the change with the most impact is probably the change of the micro profile config, where you also have now variable expansion. So that's discussed there on that page. How you can, for instance, escape that variable expansion. A few words on that EL expression vulnerability. So if you want to look up more, you can see on the screen the official bug number on that, the CVE number. And the issue was that when you have a combination of some identifiers that was incorrectly interpreted, that was the case in that EL expression implementation of Jakarta. So it was in one of the libraries that we are using. But we have patched it already locally, so you can have it already from July release onwards, fixed in the Payara server and the Payara micro versions. Although the official release of that EL expression fix is not yet done at the Jakarta level, you can also already use that newer version, and that you're protected against that one. As you can see, it is a very specific one. I don't think any developer is writing that kind of expressions in his code. So it is a very low risk, and since it is never recommended to accept any kind of expression from the users that are evaluated, so that means that probably only a few people in the world are having that kind of issues. But we mentioned this kind of things always, so that you are aware of what is going on around the security issues that might occur within the Payara platform products. A few words around that multiple key stores and trust stores. As you probably know, if you have a custom SSL certificate for your secure connections, if Payara is handling those SSL connections for you, if they are not handled by the firewall or the proxy server, then you need to upload that SSL certificate within the TrustStore of Payara itself. Payara is using a specific file for that, and you need to upload it there so that it can be used and recognized when a client makes a connection to the server. That's of course not ideal when you upgrade your Payara server version, because then you need to re-import it again if you want to use the latest trust stores which come with Payara, which is a rather long manual procedure for those who are using the community version. We have a ESAdmin command for that in the enterprise version. But now we have decided to add the possibility to have additional stores, also for key stores and trust stores. So for the trust store, you can define the parameter fish.payara.ssl.additional trust stores with a comma-separated list of files where those additional certificates can be stored. That means that if you're doing an upgrade, then the only thing that you need to specify is that same config parameter, that JVM config parameter, and you no longer need to re-import, of course, your SSL certificate within the trust store. There is one limitation that each trust store is encrypted with a password, which is for Payara the same as the master password of the environment. So that password, of course, must then be the same as that master password of Payara, because otherwise Payara cannot read the content of the trust store. Let's have a look at our, again, documentation site. We have detailed there some information around this feature of multiple key stores and trust stores. Another feature which we are working on is the developer experience. We have our IDE plugins. We have some Maven and Gradle plugins to help you creating Payara projects with running Payara projects, etc. We also have the hot deploy feature, which we are improving within the server and within Micro itself. And that means that we now have added the option of a reload task in the plugins of the Maven and Gradle, but it's mainly to support our Gradle and our IDEs, which are using those Gradle and Maven plugins. They are underneath, they are using them. And this reload task will help them so that when you click a save, for instance, within your IDE, that automatically the server, the running instance, is notified of which classes are changed and that those classes are reloaded. You can always use add, if you are not depending on that functionality, you can always create a .reload file in the top level directory of your deployment. And every time you change the timestamp, for instance, with on Unix-like machines with that touch command, then an entire reload, it's not only a few classes, but an entire reload is done. That's separately from this update to the plugins, but this reload task will be used in the coming months for the updated versions of our plugins with the IDE. As mentioned, we have released Payara 6, so an officially Jakarta EE9 certified runtime. And we get some various questions about when you should use it and how you should use it, etc. We covered this already in, for instance, in the roadmap update which is done by Steve, but I also want to mention it here then again, what the ID of Payara 5 and Payara 6 is, and when we are planning to have a more final version than what we have now, because it is indeed just an alpha 1, so we don't think it is production ready. But it is certified, so it is officially also listed on the website because we pass all the TCK tests of the Jakarta EE9, and so it is fully functional and it is working. We also worked very hard on making the possibility of having the possibility to run your Jakarta EE9 applications on Payara 5. Only community enterprise does not have that option. So through the Eclipse transformer, your Jakarta EE9 application is transformed back to an EE8 application with the Java X namespace. And so that can run on Payara 5, which is based on that version. The only thing that we could not do, and we tried, but we failed for some silly reasons, actually, because, for instance, the TCK checks for a few hard-coded values, a version number of the servlet specification. It must be 5 for EE9 and 4 with EE8. Those we fail, of course, because they don't match if we are running the EE9 TCK on Payara 5. Also, some package names, there is a check of if it's turned a certain the package name of an exception, and if it's in a certain namespace, and that checks, of course, on Jakarta, which is, of course, Java X still on Payara 5. So since Jakarta E9 is mainly a release for the tooling because of that namespace change, there are still a lot of libraries which are updating from that Java X namespace to Jakarta. You see every month some libraries which announce that they have now also support for Jakarta EE9. We believe that it is a bit too soon to use Jakarta EE9 in production. So that's why we also have only that alpha release, because, for instance, there is no micro profile which is capable of running on the Jakarta namespace. Later on, when Jakarta EE10 comes out later this year or beginning of next year, then Payara 6 will be officially released and final and supporting that Jakarta EE10, because then all the libraries are updated to that namespace, to that new namespace, and we actually have something new in Jakarta EE10, and there are quite some new features planned in EE10, so that it makes it worth changing from EE8 to EE10. Hopefully that's clear. Again, if you have still questions, we are happy to answer them on social media as mentioned before. What is in the pipeline? One of the things is running on JDK 17. It's coming out in about a month. Mid-September, there is the official release of JDK 17, which is again an LTS version, a long-term supported version. So which means that you can use it more than 6 months. And that means that we also that you will also have the opportunity to run Payara 5 on that JDK 17. So Payara 5 will still be compiled against JDK 8, but if you have an application that you like to use a new functionality of the JDK 17, for instance, those records, that new record type, then you will be able to create, to compile your application, your WAR file, for instance, against JDK 17, and you can run them on Payara then when we have updated the support for it. We are still fine-tuning that gRPC, which we mentioned 2 months ago, so that you can use Payara server as a gRPC server, so that any kind of client can connect through that protocol to the Payara server, and that you can use within your gRPC implementation, that you can use any kind of Java or Jakarta EE constructs, so you have access to the entity manager, you can to the EGBs, to CDI, etc. So it is a fully integrated version. And as you probably know, we are working on some new functionalities or improvements like autoscale and logging. So that's also a thing which continues in the coming months, and that you will see some new features and new announcements around it. So that's about the release itself, except that we did not talk about the main topics of the release, that OpenId Connect new functionality. So I thought it was a good idea to revisit OAuth and OpenId Connect a bit, and what we support within the Payara server and Payara micro for it. So quickly go over a few basics. What is OAuth to what is OpenId Connect? And then the new functionalities, the new features that we have added on top of it, the bearer authentication and the multi-tenant. But first, maybe a quick poll to see what you are using within your application as the main method where you do how you authenticate and authorize your users. Is that through credentials that you have stored within the database, hopefully with the hashed password? Are you using an LDAP server? Are you using OpenId Connect or not? Are you using any kind of other system? Because there are a lot of other tools and frameworks to do authentications, of course. Or maybe you're just using some public-facing website and that you don't need any authentication. Okay, I think that everyone had a chance to give their feedback if they want to, so let's see for the results. Okay, the majority is using credentials within a database, which I almost expect as the result, but a bit bit surprisingly, there are a lot of other systems also used outside of the main three, the database, the LDAP, and the OpenID Connect. And only one person who knows OpenID Connect very well then, so he is probably only interested in the new features, but let's first start with some basics. So the results can be removed from the screen, and then we can go to the some basics of the OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is based on OAuth 2. So that was the first protocol which was created. And you can see it as some kind of outsourcing of your login. So you're not responsible anymore for your login and your authorization, but you outsource it to an external system and you only use it. And that means that you're no longer responsible for storing usernames and passwords, which in days of security and data breaches can sometimes be very useful, that you are not responsible for doing that, that some specialized framework can be used for that. You have a few terms around it, but you all know what it's about if I explain what you're doing. So you have the resource owner, which is your user, which owns some data. And that data, that can be emails, for instance, that data can be stored in a database, and that's the resource server. So the resource server is serving the data, and of course, you as user does need access to your own data. That's obvious. But your application, your email client, for instance, cannot access the data at random. So he needs to be granted access to your data. So he needs some kind of grant that the application can access the data for you. So there are a lot of arrows on this diagram. But first thing is that the user accesses your application, tries to access the data, but the resource server says, well, I need some kind of credential that that user is allowed to see the data. So he delegates that to the authorization server, and then the authorization server pops up a screen where he can, for instance, also use username and password to log in, or he is already logged in because it is a single sign-on system. And then you as a resource owner, you need to say, yes, I grant access of my data by that application. And in that case, the authorization server issues a token to the application, and that token can be used to access your data. There are, as you see, quite some parties involved, but that is, of course, required for that separation, because we have decided that the authorization and the storing of the username and password is done by a third party. And to make it all secure, you have all those rules there and those tokens which are digital signed, etc. But OAuth 2 is basically just an authorization. So the application gets a token, and the resource server knows with that token, I can return those data. It does not know the name of the user. It does not know all the roles that the user has. So it's basically only authorization. So that's why there was a second specification created, which is called OpenId Connect, which is used on top of OAuth 2. So it is using that same diagram. But besides that authorize endpoint that you have there in the diagram, the third one, you also have a token endpoint. So that token returns information about the user. It's called the ID token about what is the username. You can also store there all the roles and permissions that a user has. And the authorized endpoint is then used to give access to that token endpoint. So within your application, you have then the full access, or the access that the user grants to the user of user information like username, email address, and roles, etc. And your endpoint, your web API, can use then that information within that ID token to decide what he does allow, that he allow access to certain parts of your application based on those roles, or use that information within that token. For instance, welcome Rudy at the beginning of the screen, that it knows who you are. So I have prepared a few demos because we have created a very easy and flexible integration of that entire OpenID authentication flow. You saw that it is on that diagram, it is with many moving parts, where many arrows, but the only thing you need to do is actually just define where the server is, where the endpoints are located, so that the application can call them for you. And you only need to define a callback method to receive that information from that authorization server, that OpenId Connect server. We have a general authentication, so you can do it with an annotation. Just need to put it on any kind of CDI bean, and then you can define that information. But we have also specific annotations if you are using Google, or if you are using Azure, Active Directory, etc. So that makes it a lot easier for you to integrate it within your application, as you will see in the demo. And then later on, I'll show the multi-tenant support. But first, let's have a look at the application. I have now here a Zoom pop-up which blocks my menu, but okay. Here I have that OpenId Connect application. It is based on Jakarta EE8, so I put that, that dependency there as provided, and I define the Payara API, and within that Payara API, we have, for instance, that Google authentication definition annotation. There are two required parameters for that authentication. That's with every OpenId Connect one, that's your client ID and your client's secret. You can define that within the microprofile config, for instance, because it is a good idea that you keep them out of your source code, because this client secret is secret, but you don't see my entire ID, so that's not an issue. With these two parameters are picked up because they have the prefix payara.security.openid, and then they are used automatically to configure the Google authentication definition here. You see that there are other options possible besides that client ID and client secret. You can define, for those who are familiar with OpenID, you can define the scopes, you can define how the response type is, etc., etc. So there are many options possible, but they all have a default. So client ID and client secret are the only required one that you need to specify. It is on a CDI bean because it is a servlet. I have here the annotation to define that it is the servlet is accessible on this URL. I define roles which are required because I say that this is a secured servlet, so that only users with that same role have access to this endpoint. So Google, for those who have worked with it, Google does not return any roles. So we need, for this example, just a custom identity store, as it's called within Jakarta e-security, which returns for a certain user the roles or the groups, because it's not converted at this point, the groups that the user has. You should do this based on the caller principle, and the caller principle is the name of the user or the ID of the user. Here, as a demo, I'm just returning that every authenticated user has that role all automatically assigned. So that means that everyone who successfully authenticates through Google is allowed to access this application, this servlet in this case. And again, this is a servlet with not best practice in the sense that I'm putting out some HTML within Java itself, but the idea is that you have access to information of that OpenId Connect system, like the access token, subject, caller name, etc., but also from the identity token, the email and name of the person, because you can just inject a OpenId context where you have all that information available for the current user. So if we look at the how the application then works, we have here then Payara server running and the latest version, the 2021.6. And we have actually two applications because the second one is to explain that peer authentication, but for the moment only that OpenId Connect is used. So if I go to the browser and let me show immediately the network here that you see what's going over the network. Then if I go to that secured page, it is localhost 8080 Auth secured. I've put it, of course, in the wrong one. Should I put it here? It's annoying that some of the screens are hidden. Okay. So at the end, because I'm within Chrome, I'm already logged in within Google. So that means that he doesn't ask my username and password. And I also gave, I granted also access of my data to that applications when I tried it earlier today. So that means that I get immediately access to that secured page and that you see that I can ask information about my identity, like my email and my name. And this is for the bearer authentication. And as you can see, the first time I asked that page, I got 302, so a redirect to Google, the account at google.com for that login. And then I get that call back with all that information, the code. You see that the code, which is the access code and some additional information. And then I did redirect to my original page, but now I'm logged in. So that means that everything works. I can access all the information. So you see only a simple annotation, a config value, and the authentication, the integration with Google Authentication is performed, or any kind of OpenId Connect. So that is a very nice one, very easy one. We have that already a few years, so that's nothing new. What is new is this part, because my application these days is probably not a monolith, so I'm calling external services. But those external services also need to know who I am. So service A calls service B. Service B says, well, you ask for this data, but am I allowed to return it? So you need to propagate that caller information. Until now, you had the option, for instance, to create a JWT token, a JWT token, with microprofile JWT authentication specification, for instance, where you package that information and you send it over, and then that second service knows enough. It can do the validations of that token. But we were thinking, why do you need to create another token? Because that access token of OpenId Connect is also a JWT-based token. So why can't we use that one instead of creating a new one? So that's what we call the bearer support, is that you call the endpoint with that access token of that second service, that, as I called it here, the helper service, and that it is using that token immediately to authenticate and not to ask the user, of course, to again username and password, because that is not useful. So let's have a look at that helper service. Again, it is a Jakarta EE web application. And I defined again that Google authentication annotation here, with again roles allowed, etc. So, and I have here within the web XML defined that everything within that EAXRS, in those EAXRS endpoints, there is a security constraint, and that you need to role all, so only authenticated users can access that endpoint. Within that endpoint, I can again, it's kind of hello world, so I specify some parameter and I return the content of that parameter, but I also include the user information I get back from my OpenId context information. So I ask here the same as before, but now based on that access token, give me the name of that user. And it is still secure because, for instance, if I do a curl to this hello endpoint, then I'm not getting my expected outcome, but I get in fact, the Google page to put in my username and password. Maybe I should use it without the follow-up, so without following redirects, and it's easier. See, I get a document moved as a response. I get a 302 with a redirect to accounts Google. So it is not accessible unless I specify username and password, or when that bearer token is there. So how can I pass that access token then from my original first application to the to that second one? That can be easily be done by using the microprofile REST client, because they have defined a possibility to customize the headers when you are using the REST client. And here I specify that for each call that the REST client makes, that I add a certain header with that authorization, the bearer, and that identity token or access token, but both can be used. So my secured page here, besides the information, it's also building that can be done only once, but okay, I've done it here every time. It creates a URL to that helper endpoint, and it's calling the helper endpoint with just Payara OIDC. But when I get back, I get that information from the remote service, but I also get the information from the authentication from OpenId Connect, that actually that second service knows who I am and also is authenticated. So I did not get an error because it was not authenticated, because I specified that ID token or that access token with that header factory that I showed you. So that's the bearer authentication, so that you just can specify here to propagate your information from one service to another, and that you don't need to switch to, for instance, to microprofile JOT specification. Not that it is not good, but if you only need that specification for the propagation of your identity, well, that was maybe an overkill, because you need to maintain all those security keys to in order to maintain that situation. So this is easier. A second functionality that we added is the option of multi-tenant support. So there are cases that your application is not used by one set of people, let's say one company, but it is the same application, maybe just a little bit of styling differences, is used by several groups of people, by several companies. So you have the single tenant model, which is possible. So that means you install your application multiple times, but with multiple databases, and your users are nicely separated as it should be. Of course, again, with the monolith, that's easier to do. If you have more a microservice architecture, then you need maybe to duplicate a lot of your environment, install a lot of your services in double. And maybe that's not needed, because some of the services are not used a lot, and maybe they should be reused between different users of different companies. So the multi-tenant model, it's already a concept which is long known, and so it's nothing new, is that instead of deploying your application multiple times, you only deploy your application once. That can be in a cluster so that you have enough capacity. It can be that several microservices are working together. But one thing that you need to be sure is that your users are still separated, because they should not mix and match between different companies, because probably they don't even know that other companies are using that same application. So one thing that you can do is, for instance, put them in a different OpenId Connect provider, so that they authenticate to different providers, so they are clearly separated. There is no chance that there is a mixture or mix-up between those users. That means that we need to be able to specify a client ID and a client secret depending on the user, depending on the tenant. And that's my second example. I'm going to switch already from domain, so that it is ready when I finished my explanation about the demo itself. So I've created a second domain where I deployed this application. Again, the same Jakarta EE8 web application. Again, with that secured page, but this time my client ID and client secret is not fixed, it's not hard-coded, but it is resolved through an EL expression. An EL expression that needs to determine if it's company 1 or company 2, for instance, in this example. That EL expression means that we have a named CDI bean, where we can inject, for instance, the current HTTP servlet request. For those that do not know that, it is possible to do that. Which means that you can ask a client ID based on the tenant, and the tenant, most of the time it is in the domain name, so it is based on some part of the domain names. I made it myself easy here for this example, and I look at a certain parameter. Is there a certain parameter which called tenant, which is certain value? And then based on that, I'm again looking up externally my client IDs and my client secrets. But now I can give them a custom prefix, but I can say the client ID for company 1 is this, and the client ID for company 2 is this. So it's the different ones. Of course, this evaluation of EL expressions is slowing down your system. So that's why we have opted for the situation that you explicitly need to say that an EL expression is there and that it will be evaluated. And it's based on the sessions, on the HTTP session. So that's why we have named that configuration parameter here, session scoped configuration. By default is false. So if you need to have that expression evaluation, as in this example, you need to put it on true. For the rest, it is the same. So if I go to that application, and I have put here is company one. Can maybe close this, because then you see that I'm coming in this time, not Google, but I'm using Auth0, which is another provider which you can use in the cloud. Then you see that I end up on a domain, an application, how you call it within Auth0, which is named company one. So that matches the same parameter that I'm using there at the URL. If again, continue with Google, then Auth0 is forwarding. So you can also use that functionality, that proxy functionality of an OpenID server provider that it can proxy for other things. Again, you see my identity is the same person. I'm going to be safe on another browser, and it's clearly another session. If someone else, and it's not in my history anymore. Yes, it is. If someone else logs in with company 2, then I was still logged on. Sorry, you cannot see it. But then you would see that I would clearly end up with the Auth0 information of company 2. So I was logging into a different one than the first one, but yeah, I was not cleaning up my previous example properly, it seems. So that's the idea of the multi-tenant, so that you can specify client ID and client secret based on some information which is available within the request. Most of the time, as I mentioned, it is based on the domain host, but domain name, but it can be something different. That's it for the demos. Not sure, Priya, if there is already some questions around what I showed.
So we had a question from Anbu, who had to leave, but he says he's going to watch back the recording. He said, are there any plans to make the changes you discussed about OpenID move standard specification under Jakarta EE security?
Yes, for Jakarta EE10, there is the goal of having OpenId Connect within the Jakarta EE specification. Actually, it is my task to put it there, so I'm working on that. But I have a lot of things to do, so it's moving rather slowly. But yes, the OpenId Connect, but probably only the basic things, not things like multi-tenant, like I discussed today, for instance. But the basic integration, the basic standardization will be available within Jakarta EE10 with the next release.
Great. Hopefully he'll be able to watch back the recording and get that answer that he needs. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat and I'll relay them to Rudy.
Around any of the topics I discussed here, or anything general around Payara, that's, I'm happy to answer them.
Thanks from Germany.
Okay, maybe
Ralph and Christoph.
Yeah, maybe I get the opportunity to announce a next meetup. The date is not final yet, But with Nicholas, we are doing a presentation on using the new Hazelcast SQL feature and Payara Micro. So Hazelcast has added an SQL-like way, to an SQL-like option to search through the entire data grid, which makes it, of course, better because you can do then distributed searches as it should be. So we will demonstrate that in combination with Payara Micro somewhere in September. So watch out on that meetup page to get the announcement.
Yeah, I've shared the link. So if you're interested, just make sure you're on the meetup page and you can register. Right. So are there any more questions? No. I think that's great then. So we'll be sharing the recording afterwards. Everyone say thank you. Thanks from Martin. Thanks from Ulrich.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for watching, and hopefully see you next time around in 2 months for a next release webinar around the new features and another monthly topic.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'll end the meeting now, but yeah, thanks, Rudy, and see you again soon. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, bye.